It was a summer morning in late July 2024 when a group of children gathered at a dance studio in Southport, a quiet seaside town in the United Kingdom. The theme was lighthearted, Taylor Swift. The kids were making friendship bracelets, singing songs, and enjoying the kind of carefree joy that should define childhood. But within minutes, that joy would be shattered. A teenager named Axel Rudakubana entered the studio wearing a green hoodie and a surgical mask. He didn't speak. He didn't hesitate. He carried a kitchen knife with a blade nearly 8 inches long, purchased online days earlier, and he began stabbing. The attack lasted 15 minutes. By the time it ended, 3 young girls were dead: 7-year-old Elsie Stancombe, 6-year-old BB King, and 9-year-old Alice da Silva Aguiar. 10 others were wounded: 8 children, a dance instructor, and a businessman who had rushed in from a neighboring office to help. The scene was described by first responders as something out of a horror film. Children ran screaming from the building, some bleeding from stab wounds to their backs. Others tried to shield their friends. One girl, already injured, dragged her younger sister behind her to protect her. Another child, stabbed twice, stayed behind to help others escape. The instructor, Leanne Lucas, was stabbed multiple times but insisted paramedics treat the children first. Her colleague, Heidi Little, barricaded herself and a child inside a bathroom, likely saving that child's life. And Jonathan Hayes, the businessman next door, confronted the attacker and bought precious seconds for others to flee, though he too was seriously injured. Axel Rudakubana was 17 years old. He had once been a cheerful boy, active in karate and drama club. Born in Cardiff to Rwandan Christian parents who had fled genocide, he grew up in a small village called Banks in Lancashire. His parents, Alphonse and Letitia, had hoped for a better life. But something went wrong. Around the age of 13, Rudakubana began showing disturbing signs. He was excluded from school for bringing knives. He researched mass shootings. He asked for images of severed heads during art class. He was referred to the UK's counter-extremism program, Prevent, not once but 3 times, yet no action was taken. Authorities deemed him non-ideological dangerous, yes, but not a terrorist. At home, his parents found weapons arriving in the mail: a machete, a kitchen knife. They admitted to hiding some of them, but said they were too afraid to confront him. His mother's fingerprints were later found on the packaging of the knife used in the attack. After the murders, police searched Rudakubana's bedroom. They found a copy of the Al-Qaeda training manual. They found ricin, a deadly biological toxin, produced in his room. Prosecutors would later describe the attack as a calculated attempt at mass murder, with no clear motive beyond destruction itself. The aftermath was explosive. Misinformation spread online, falsely claiming the attacker was a Muslim asylum seeker. Riots broke out across the country. A mosque in Southport was vandalized. Over the next week, the UK saw its worst civil unrest since the 2011 riots. More than 1,000 arrests were made. In January of 2025, Rudakubana pleaded guilty to all charges: 3 counts of murder, 10 counts of attempted murder, possession of a bladed weapon, and terrorism-related offenses. During sentencing, he disrupted the courtroom by declaring he was glad the children were dead. The judge called him pure evil and sentenced him to life in prison with a minimum term of 52 years. Given his age, that effectively means he will never be released. He is currently incarcerated at HMP Belmarsh, a high-security prison known for housing some of the UK's most dangerous offenders. In May of 2025, police began investigating an alleged assault he committed against a prison officer. The Southport tragedy has sparked national debate in Britain. How could a teenager with such a clear history of violence slip through the cracks? Why did multiple agencies fail to intervene? And what does it mean when someone commits mass murder not for ideology, but seemingly for the act itself? For American viewers, this case may feel eerily familiar. The themes, youth radicalization, institutional failure, and senseless violence echo tragedies seen across the United States. But what makes Southport especially haunting is the innocence of the setting. A dance class, a summer morning, a room full of children singing Taylor Swift. It was supposed to be a day of joy. Instead, it became a symbol of everything that can go wrong when warning signs are ignored. In early November 1998, The quiet suburb of Lakewood in Jacksonville, Florida, was shaken by the disappearance of 8-year-old Maddie Clifton. She had gone outside to play, bouncing a baseball in the driveway, and never returned. Her family, frantic, called the police. What followed was one of the most intense missing child searches in Florida's history. Flyers were posted on every corner. Neighbors combed the streets. News outlets broadcast pleas from Maddie's parents. But for 7 days, no one suspected that the smiling boy helping with the search was the one who knew exactly where Maddie was. Josh Phillips, 14, was the quintessential boy next door. He played baseball, mowed lawns, and greeted neighbors with a wave. He was polite, well-liked, and seemingly trustworthy. He joined search parties, taped flyers to telephone poles, and walked beside volunteers. But behind the facade, Josh was hiding a horrific secret. Maddie's body was under his bed. On November 10th, Josh's mother, Melissa Phillips, decided to clean his room. She noticed a strange smell and a damp spot near his waterbed. As she investigated, she lifted the mattress and screamed. Wrapped in sheets and plastic was the body of Maddie Clifton. Melissa ran outside, still screaming, and called the police. Officers arrived within minutes. Josh was arrested and taken into custody. The community was stunned. The boy they had trusted had spent 7 days eating dinner, playing video games, and sleeping inches above the body of the girl everyone was searching for. During questioning, Josh broke down. He claimed Maddie had come over to play baseball. He said he accidentally hit her with the ball, and when she cried, he panicked. Afraid of his father's strict rules, especially the one forbidding girls in the house, Josh said he tried to silence her. But what followed was far more than a moment of panic. According to investigators, Josh struck Maddie multiple times with a baseball bat, then stabbed her repeatedly. The injuries were not consistent with an accident. Prosecutors argued that the concealment of the body and Josh's ability to maintain a normal routine for a week showed calculation, not fear. Psychologists later described Josh's behavior as a form of dissociation, a mental detachment from reality. He had created a fantasy world where nothing had happened, and he clung to it as a defense mechanism. "Ignore it and it will go away," he reportedly said. But the truth couldn't be buried forever. Josh was charged with first-degree murder. Because Florida law at the time allowed juveniles to be tried as adults for serious crimes, he faced the same penalties as an adult. His trial began in 1999, and the courtroom was packed. Cameras zoomed in on a boy barely tall enough to see over the defense table. His attorneys portrayed him as emotionally immature, terrified of his father, and incapable of rational thought. His mother testified, voice trembling, "Josh isn't a monster. He's my son. He's just a boy who panicked." But the jury saw something else. A boy who had committed a brutal act and then pretended to be part of the search effort. After a brief deliberation, the jury found Josh Phillips guilty of first-degree murder. The sentence was mandatory: life in prison without the possibility of parole. At just 14 years old, Josh was condemned to spend the rest of his life behind bars. The verdict sparked national debate. Critics argued that children should not be sentenced to life without parole, especially in cases where emotional and psychological factors may have played a role. Supporters of the sentence said justice had been served for Maddie Clifton and her family. In 2012, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that mandatory life sentences for juveniles were unconstitutional. This landmark decision opened the door for Josh's case to be reconsidered. By 2017, Josh had spent more years in prison than he had ever lived as a free person. His lawyers described him as rehabilitated, a model inmate who tutored others and expressed deep remorse. But when Maddie's sister spoke at the resentencing hearing, her words silenced the room. He got to grow up. Maddie didn't. The judge upheld the original sentence. Josh Phillips remained incarcerated at Cross City Correctional Institution in Florida. As of 2025, Josh has spent 26 years in prison, nearly twice the age he was when the crime occurred. His case continues to be cited in discussions about juvenile justice, mental health, and the limits of rehabilitation. The tragedy of Maddie Clifton's death is compounded by the unsettling reality that her killer was not a stranger, but a neighbor, a child himself. The case forces us to confront difficult questions. Can a 14-year-old truly understand the consequences of such violence? Should society offer second chances to those who commit heinous acts as children? Or are some crimes so severe that redemption is no longer possible? Josh Phillips was not a repeat offender. He had no history of violence. But the nature of his crime, the brutality, the concealment, the deception, left little room for leniency. His ability to maintain a facade for 7 days, while sleeping above the body of his victim, remains one of the most chilling aspects of the case. Ultimately, the story of Josh Phillips and Maddie Clifton is not just about crime and punishment. It's about the fragility of trust, the complexity of adolescence, and the enduring pain of a family that lost their daughter. It's a reminder that evil can wear a friendly face and that justice, no matter how it's delivered, can never truly undo the harm. Love your children. Treasure every single moment. Never assume they know how much you care. Tell them. Keep your eyes on where they are, who they're with, and never, ever take them for granted. Those are the words Jackie Scherer, mother of 12-year-old Shanda Scherer, would want every parent to hear. Because in January of 1992, in Madison, Indiana, something horrible tore every illusion of safety for one family and for a community. Shanda Renee Scherer was 12 years old. She was the kind of girl who laughed easily, who loved cheerleading, music, and nights with friends. Her life was just beginning. Yet one bitter rivalry, jealousy, and a dark plan turned everything upside down. What unfolded was one of the most horrific crimes in recent American history, not just because of the brutality, but because of who committed it. Among the perpetrators were 4 teenage girls. Melinda Loveless was 16, Lori Tackett was 17. Hope Anna Rippey and Tony Lawrence were both 15. Their target, Shanda. The motive, jealousy born when Shanda began forming a friendship, a romantic closeness with Amanda Heverin, someone Loveless had once dated. Loveless felt threatened, wounded, and convinced Shanda must be made to suffer. On the night of January 10, 1992, all 4 girls lured Shanda from her father's home with a lie that she was needed to see Amanda later. Trusting them, she agreed. They drove her to an abandoned spot. What followed was hours of torture, beating, strangling, stabbing. Shanda pleaded. She screamed. The girls bound her with rope, stripped her to her underwear, mocked her, threatened her with sharp objects. When they believed she was dead, they placed her body in the trunk of a car. Later, hearing her still alive, they stabbed her again. Then, in a remote field, they wrapped her in a blanket, poured gasoline on her, and set her on fire. She was alive when the flames first touched her. Her body was discovered later by hunters. Investigators struggled to identify her because her burns were so severe. All 4 were charged as adults. Plea deals were made to avoid the death penalty. Loveless, Tackett, and Rippey pleaded guilty to murder, criminal confinement, and arson. Lawrence, who cooperated earlier, accepted a lesser role in the legal terms crime of criminal confinement. Sentences were among the longest allowed under their pleas. Melinda Loveless and Lori Tackett each received 60 years in prison. Hope Rippey also got a 60-year sentence, with 10 years suspended. Tony Lawrence was sentenced to 20 years. Over time, many of the 4 were released. Tony Lawrence was paroled in 2000, after serving about 9 years. Hope Rippey followed, released in 2006. Lori Tackett was freed in 2018. And Melinda Loveless, the one seen by many as the mastermind, was released in September of 2019. During her time incarcerated, Jackie Scherer, Shanda's mother, became a public voice not only demanding justice, but later doing something unexpected, offering forgiveness. She supported the idea of rehabilitation, even when many in the public believed some of the girls should never walk free again. Her journey was one of unbearable pain, but also of rare compassion. The trial exposed cruel details. Shanda's body was found in a pugilistic stance, arms outstretched, fists clenched. Her face and hands burned nearly beyond recognition. The girls attempted to hide her identity. The evidence that helped convict them included confessions from both Rippey and Lawrence, statements given by Lawrence and Rippey to sheriff's offices with their parents. Between these and witness testimony, plus forensic evidence, the prosecution built a case that left little room for doubt. Public reaction was intense. Many questioned how teenage girls, not grown men, not criminals hardened by time, could plan, carry out, and then seemingly return to everyday life after such violence. How jealousy, rumor, instability of home life, neglect, abuse, these all played roles. But none of it erased what they did. The legal aftermath raised debates about juvenile justice in America. Should children who commit heinous crimes be sentenced as adults? What role does mental health, abuse, neglect play in mitigating responsibility? When is parole appropriate? When is forgiveness even possible? Shanda's case is still cited in discussions of how law, psychology, and morality intersect. Shanda Shara was 12. She had braces. She liked music, hanging out, just being a kid. She trusted. And she died because trust was twisted, betrayal was chosen. Her story is unforgettable. A horror, yes, but also a warning. A reminder that hatred can burn just as hot coming from adolescence as from adulthood. That cruelty is not always born in adulthood, and that the people we think are closest might be capable of betrayal unimaginable. It was Easter Monday, April 25th, 2011. The streets of Nottingham, England were quiet, painted in the soft gray of a spring morning. Families were still lingering over breakfast, children watching cartoons, parents enjoying a rare day off. Inside one neat suburban home, a 14-year-old boy named Daniel Bartlam sat in front of his television, lost in the glow of his favorite shows. To anyone else, he was just another quiet teenager, shy, polite, and withdrawn. But inside Daniel's mind, something dark had been taking shape for months, a fantasy that would soon blur the line between fiction and life. Daniel had grown up an only child, raised by his mother, Jacqueline Bartlam, a caring woman in her 40s who worked hard to give her son stability after separating from his father. She loved her children fiercely, but Daniel was changing. Once affectionate and talkative, he had become distant, moody, and unpredictable. He spent hours locked in his room, surrounded by video games, comic books, and the flickering dramas on his television screen. Shows like Coronation Street and Emmerdale became his world stories of betrayal, murder, and revenge, always resolved neatly before the credits rolled. To Jacqueline, his obsession seemed harmless. To Daniel, it was education. He began to write his own scripts, short stories about imaginary characters who mirrored his own frustrations. One story in particular stood out. It told of a boy named Daniel who murdered his mother with a hammer and burned down the house to destroy the evidence. The story was written like a screenplay, scene by scene, complete with dialogue and stage directions. In Daniel's mind, it wasn't fantasy anymore. It was rehearsal. In the weeks before Easter, the tension between mother and son escalated. They argued about homework, screen time, and curfews. Jacqueline tried to set boundaries. Daniel pushed back harder each time. Friends and teachers saw a boy who was polite but withdrawn, a kid who smiled when spoken to but rarely looked anyone in the eye. No one knew that behind his quiet demeanor, he was planning something unspeakable. On that April morning, as the rest of Britain celebrated the holiday, Daniel waited patiently for his moment. His mother sat in the living room watching television, completely unaware that her son had already chosen his weapon, a claw hammer he'd taken from the garage days earlier. At some point that day, Daniel walked up behind her and with one brutal swing, turned fantasy into reality. The blow was swift, violent, and final. In a single instant, the woman who had loved him most was gone. Afterward, Daniel dragged her body into her bedroom. There was no panic, no hesitation. He poured lighter fluid across the room, struck a match, and watched the flames begin to spread. Then he packed a small bag, took his pet hamster, and walked out into the night. To the neighbors who later saw him wandering nearby, he looked calm, almost bored. When the fire brigade arrived, they thought they were responding to a tragic house fire. But the pattern of the flames told another story. The burns were localized, the fire deliberate. And Jacqueline Bartlam had already been dead before the blaze began. The next morning, police found Daniel walking alone, not far from the smoldering ruins of his home. His clothes smelled faintly of smoke. When questioned, he told officers that an intruder had broken in and attacked his mother, setting the fire as he escaped. He claimed he'd barely managed to get out alive. It might have worked if Daniel hadn't left behind the story. During the search of his bedroom, detectives discovered a computer file, a violent short story titled The Psycho, describing almost exactly what had happened. The plot was identical. A teenage boy kills his mother with a hammer, sets the house on fire, and runs away. Every scene matched reality. When confronted with the script, Daniel's facade began to crack. He first insisted it was coincidence. Then, quietly, he confessed. He told detectives he didn't know why he'd done it. He said he'd been angry, confused, that it had been a moment of madness, but the evidence told a colder truth. Investigators found that he had planned every step from choosing the weapon to hiding the evidence. The judge later called it a chilling act of calculation by a boy who understood exactly what he was doing. When the case went to trial in 2012, the courtroom was filled with disbelief. A boy barely into his teens stood accused of one of the most shocking crimes in recent British history. The prosecution painted Daniel as manipulative and remorseless, pointing to his writing and the deliberate nature of the fire. They described a young man who wanted to live out a fantasy to direct his own horror film. The defense countered with a plea of diminished responsibility, arguing that Daniel's mind had been warped by violent media and adolescent confusion. Psychiatrists debated for months. Some described him as emotionally detached, possibly narcissistic, with no clear grasp of empathy. Others said he was simply immature, a child who mistook make-believe for control. Throughout the trial, Daniel sat quietly, rarely looking up. He never cried. He never apologized. When the verdict was finally read, the courtroom fell silent, guilty of murder. The judge sentenced him to life imprisonment, with a minimum term of 16 years before parole could be considered. He would serve his sentence in a secure youth facility before being transferred to an adult prison once he came of age. For Jacqueline's family, the verdict brought no peace. Her relatives told reporters that she had lived for her children, that she had believed Daniel was just going through a difficult phase. To imagine that he had planned her death and written it like a movie was unbearable. She adored him, one relative said, and he turned her love into a script. Detectives who worked the case would later say that the most haunting part wasn't the violence, but the ordinariness of it all. Daniel didn't fit the image of a killer. He wasn't angry in the traditional sense. He didn't shout or lash out. He planned, wrote, rehearsed, and then performed. One investigator said, "He looked like every other boy you'd see walking home from school." And that's what made it terrifying. In prison, Daniel has kept mostly to himself. Officers describe him as quiet, compliant, obsessed with books and television. Some say he still talks about his favorite dramas as if they're real, blurring that same line between story and life. He has never spoken publicly about the murder. No interviews, no letters, no explanations. As of 2025, Daniel Bartlam remains behind bars somewhere in the United Kingdom. Now in his late 20s, he is eligible for parole in the late 2020s, though few believe the public would ever accept his release. For many, his name remains a reminder of how fragile that boundary between imagination and reality can be, and how horror sometimes hides behind the most ordinary faces. Daniel once dreamed of being a writer, a director, the creator of his own stories. But in the end, the story consumed him. He became the villain in the script he wrote himself, trapped forever in the fiction he tried to make real. In the spring of 2016, the quiet market town of Spalding in Lincolnshire, England, became the backdrop for one of the most disturbing double murders in modern British history. The perpetrators weren't hardened criminals or strangers lurking in the shadows. They were two 14-year-olds, Kim Edwards and Lucas Markham, who saw themselves not as killers, but as soulmates trapped in a world that didn't understand them. To their classmates, Kim and Lucas were an unremarkable teenage couple, quiet, inseparable, and often lost in their own world. They spent hours texting, watching movies, and fantasizing about escaping their lives. But beneath the surface, their bond was steeped in resentment, trauma, and a shared detachment from reality. What began as adolescent infatuation soon spiraled into a deadly obsession. Kim's home life was strained. She resented her mother, Elizabeth Edwards, a 49-year-old school dinner lady, whom she blamed for the breakdown of their family. Her younger sister, Katie, just 13, was cheerful and trusting, completely unaware of the storm brewing in her sister's mind. Lucas, meanwhile, had his own demons. Expelled from school and living in foster care, he often expressed feelings of worthlessness and alienation. Together, the two teens found solace in each other's bitterness. Their conversations turned darker in early 2016. They began to speak of a fresh start, a life free from interference. In a chilling series of text messages later recovered by police, Kim told Lucas that her mother deserved it. Lucas responded with unwavering loyalty. "I'll do anything for you." On the night of April 13th, 2016, they put their plan into motion. Lucas brought a knife from his foster home and entered Kim's house through a window. The two crept upstairs while Elizabeth and Katie slept. Lucas stabbed Elizabeth first, then turned to Katie, who had woken up and screamed. He later told police that Kim had instructed him to kill both. Kim remained downstairs during the attack, but she knew exactly what was happening. What followed was perhaps even more chilling than the murders themselves. Instead of fleeing, Kim and Lucas stayed in the house. They drew the curtains, ran a bath together, watched DVDs of the Twilight Saga, ate ice cream, and cuddled in bed mere meters from the bodies of Kim's mother and sister. For over 12 hours, they lived in a surreal bubble, whispering that they were finally free. When Elizabeth failed to show up for work the next day, a concerned colleague contacted the police. Officers arrived at the house and found the teens in bed together. Kim was calm. Lucas was silent. Investigators described the scene as one of the most emotionally vacant they had ever encountered. During interrogation, Lucas confessed quickly. He said he had killed for Kim because she asked him to. Kim, too, admitted her role without remorse. She told detectives she felt relieved. Her motive, she said, was simple. She wanted her mother out of the way so she could be with Lucas. The trial later that year drew national attention. Journalists, psychologists, and legal experts packed the courtroom, trying to understand how two children could commit such a calculated act and then behave so normally afterward. Prosecutors argued that while Lucas carried out the killings, Kim was the architect. They portrayed her as manipulative and emotionally detached, while Lucas was described as loyal and easily influenced. Kim showed little emotion throughout the proceedings. When asked if she loved her mother, she replied, "Not anymore." The revelation that the pair had spent hours watching Twilight after the murders stunned the courtroom. One reporter described the atmosphere as frozen disbelief. The defense leaned heavily on the teen's age and mental health. Both had histories of depression and trauma. Their lawyers argued that they had lost touch with reality, consumed by a fantasy of eternal love and control. But the evidence was overwhelming. The jury found both guilty of double murder. In November 2016, Kim Edwards and Lucas Markham were sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 20 years. The judge described them as extraordinarily cold, calculating, and self-absorbed. On appeal in 2019, their sentences were reduced to 17.5 years. Even after sentencing, neither teen seemed to fully grasp the gravity of their actions. In recorded interviews, they spoke about writing letters to each other and reuniting in the future. But their contact was eventually severed. As of 2025, Kim is 23rd and Lucas is 24. Both remain incarcerated in separate facilities in the UK, still serving their minimum terms. The Spalding murders continue to haunt the British public not just for the brutality of the crime, but for the eerie calm that followed. The case has sparked ongoing debate about juvenile justice, mental health, and the influence of media on vulnerable minds. How could two 14-year-olds plan and execute such a horrific act? Were they victims of their circumstances or simply evil? Some experts argue that the pair were deeply disturbed, shaped by trauma and isolation. Others see the murders as a chilling reminder that age does not preclude cruelty. The case has been studied in criminology courses, featured in documentaries, and dissected in the press. It remains one of the most shocking examples of adolescent violence in the UK. Ultimately, the story of Kim Edwards and Lucas Markham is not just about a crime, it's about the collapse of empathy, the dangers of unchecked obsession, and the devastating consequences of emotional detachment. It's a story that forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about youth, responsibility, and the thin line between fantasy and reality. It was a Monday morning in late January of 1979. Across the street from Grover Cleveland Elementary School in San Diego, the sun rose on a cool, ordinary day. Children gathered at the schoolyard, chatting, laughing, backpacks slung over their shoulders, minds on lessons and recess. But just opposite that playground, in a modest, dilapidated house, 16-year-old Brenda Ann Spencer was quietly preparing to change everything. Brenda wasn't a student at that school. She lived across the street. Her life until that point had been a steady drift through neglect, heartbreak, and warning signs that went unheeded. When her parents divorced, she lived with her father, Wallace Spencer, in a home described by acquaintances as cold, bare, and full of emptiness. They shared a single mattress in the living room floor. Alcohol bottles littered the house. Teachers said she was bright in some ways. She had a talent for photography and once won a prize from the Humane Society, but in school she was inattentive, often dozing off. She skipped classes. She seemed distant. A crucial detail that people began pointing to later. During tests after her arrest, doctors found that Brenda had suffered a brain injury to one of the temporal lobes. That injury was attributed to a bicycle accident. Some argued this damage may have played a role in her erratic behavior, in impulses perhaps she could not fully control. In late 1978, things were getting worse. A probation officer's psychiatric evaluation recommended she be sent to a mental hospital for depression. Her father refused. That same year, she shot out windows of the elementary school with a BB gun and was arrested for burglary. She also spoke openly about violence. She expressed hostility toward law enforcement, used harsh language, talked about something big she wanted to do, and made comments that frightened classmates. Then came January 29th, 1979. Early in the morning, while kids waited for school to open, Brenda opened a semi-automatic 22 caliber rifle, a Ruger 10/22, from a window of her home across the street. She fired. Principal Burton Ragg, 53, stepped outside to help children. Custodian Michael Sukar, 56, tried to pull students to safety. Both men were shot and killed. 8 students were injured, as was a responding police officer. Miraculously, no children died. The chaos was raw. Shock rippled through the school, the neighborhood, the nation. Brenda didn't surrender immediately. Negotiators tried. Police surrounded the house. She held them off for hours. At some point, a reporter from the San Diego Union Tribune got her on the phone. The question was, why did you do it? Brenda's response was chilling in its simplicity. I don't like Mondays. This livens up the day. That phrase echoed across America. Journalists repeated it. Radio stations played it, and later an Irish rock band, the Boomtown Rats, immortalized it in a song. I don't like Mondays. She was charged as an adult. In April of 1980, a day after her 18th birthday, Brenda pleaded guilty to 2 counts of first-degree murder plus assault with a deadly weapon. Her sentence, life imprisonment, with the possibility of parole after 25 years. Even decades later, parole was repeatedly denied, partly because she has never clearly expressed remorse. Her mental health treatment in prison included medications for depression and, after diagnosis, therapy for epilepsy. Over time, Brenda has given many different and sometimes contradictory versions of her story. In parole hearings, she has alleged abuse, neglect, mental illness, head injury, suicidal ideation. She has claimed that the rifle was a gift, that she wanted a radio but got a gun. Sometimes she has said she hoped police would shoot her. Sometimes she insists she doesn't remember. Scrutiny of these claims has found that many of them are unverified or contradicted by earlier testimony and documentation. Public memory of the case remains strong. The "not Monday" line haunts. A reminder that an unimaginable act of violence can spring from a moment of utter randomness or from a mind in deep distress, depending on how you see it. Brenda Spencer's case is often cited in studies of school shootings and juvenile perpetrators because she complicates every easy explanation. Was this teen purely evil? Was she deeply ill? Did her environment break her? Or did she make a cold, deliberate choice? What lingers most is the failure of prevention. Teachers saw her drifting, psychologists saw depression, probation officers saw risk, but none of them could stop it. The rifle was in the house. Her threats, her strange remarks, her behavior all warning lights. And yet, Monday came. The shots came. 2 innocents died. More were wounded. And words spoken with eerie casualness became the headline, I don't like Mondays. For the families of Principal Ragg and Custodian Suchar, the loss was permanent. For students who survived, memories carried the trauma into adulthood. For society, it marked an early, jarring precedent. Schoolyard massacres were not just a specter, they were real, and they could come from unexpected places. I first heard about it on a quiet evening in the spring of 2014 in the small English town of Colchester. The name was nearly innocuous, just a teenager, 15 years old, carrying a knife, nothing that in and of itself would trigger alarm bells. But what happened in the shadows of that town would unravel into a story of obsession, terror, planning, and random death. His name was James Fairweather. On the surface, he seemed like any other awkward teenager, withdrawn, bullied, a student in a hoodie with headphones on, nothing that marked him as the face of horror. But under that quiet exterior simmered something far darker. He idolized infamous murderers, read everything he could find about serial killers, watched films about the macabre, and dreamed of committing the kind of crime that would make his name live on. The first strike came on the morning of March 29, 2014. A man in his early 30s named James Atfield had been sitting on a bench in Castle Park after a night out. He had suffered brain injury years earlier and was vulnerable. Fairweather, roaming the streets with a large knife and gloves, spotted him asleep on the grass. What followed was brutal. Over 100 stab wounds. The knife plunged into abdomen, head, through an eye, severing the jugular. The victim fought back. Defensive wounds on his arms and hands revealed that. Fairweather described later how voices told him to act, how he saw his victim lying there on the grass, how the voices laughed, how he stood there first, then struck. He told officers that in that moment his reality merged with the screenplay he had written in his mind. What it looked like was less rage and more cold, calculated execution. After the murder, he washed the weapon, disposed of his blood-soaked clothes, threw the knife into a fast-flowing stream. He covered his tracks with a detached precision. The town of Colchester was rocked. For months, the case went cold. The police interviewed dozens of people, tracked clues, but had little to go on. Then, on the morning of June 17, 2014, the second killing, a 31-year-old woman named Nahid Al-Manea, a Saudi Arabian student at the University of Essex, walking alone on the Salary Brook Trail. Dressed in traditional Islamic clothing, carrying a bag, sunglasses on, she never saw him coming. He attacked from behind, stabbed her in the back, spun her around, knocked off her glasses deliberately, and thrust the knife through her eyes into her brain. The act was grotesque, sadistic, pre-planned. The impact was devastating. A student walking to class became the victim of a random slaughter. The fear in the town escalated. Police arrested workers, patrolled trails, cleared overgrowth. Locals stopped walking alone. The idea of safety evaporated. Over the next 11 months, Fairweather remained free, lurking, plotting. He kept lists of victims, read obsessively about murderers, looked at media coverage of his own crimes, though not yet publicly connected. He was arrested late May 2015 after a dog walker felt uneasy as he lingered near the scene of the second murder, wearing rubber grip gloves and carrying a lock knife. He didn't run. When police stopped him, he said, "I was going to kill someone tonight. They found the weapon in his bag, the gloves. It was over." In interrogation, he spoke of voices again. "We're going to come and get you. You need to do it." He admitted to the murders with chilling calm, described them as practice, expressed no remorse. He said he believed he was chosen, that sacrifice was required, but experts were divided. Some psychiatrists said he suffered from paranoid schizophrenia or full-blown psychosis. Others said his account was cliched, drawn from horror movies, that the real truth was a young man who knew exactly what he was doing. At trial in April 2016, Fairweather, now 17, sat quietly as a jury heard evidence of planning: gloves, weapon, list of targets, internet research into serial killers like Peter Sutcliffe and Ted Bundy. The judge said the crimes were brutal and sadistic. The defense argued diminished responsibility due to mental disorder. The prosecution argued that his culpability remained high. The jury rejected the defense. On the 29th of April 2016, he was sentenced to life imprisonment, minimum term of 27 years before parole possible. As for the victims, James Atfield's family described him as gentle, fun, loving, and unable to defend himself the night he died. Nahid Al-Manea's family remembered her as hopeful, kind, a student chasing her dreams, and her death left them shattered. In prison, Fairweather remains quiet, often described as polite, always reading, always writing. He rarely speaks publicly. His motive? Fame, control, the thrill of terror. He became the creator, director, star, and victim of his own fantasy. The town of Colchester changed. For months fearful, for years scarred. Today, 2025, he remains incarcerated in the UK. He will be eligible for parole in the early 2040s, though many believe he will never be released. The echo of his crimes still lingers. The randomness, the cold precision, the teenage face behind the blade. What warns us is not the obvious monster, but the ordinary one, the quiet kid in the hoodie. Because sometimes the scariest thing of all is the one you never saw coming. In the spring of 1968, the city of Newcastle upon Tyne in northern England was shocked by a crime so disturbing it seemed like a nightmare. The perpetrator was not a hardened criminal, not even a teenager, but a child. 10-year-old Mary Flora Bell became infamous for taking the lives of two younger children in a case that would leave a lasting scar on British society. Growing up, Mary Bell's life was marked by chaos. Born in May of 1957, she was raised in poverty, neglect, and instability. Her mother, Betty, struggled with addiction, disappeared for periods, and was often absent. Mary was sometimes left in dangerous care. Teachers said Mary exhibited troubling behavior, cruelty to other children, manipulation, volatile moods. Even before the killings, those who interacted with her sensed something deeply wrong. Mary's crimes came in two terrible episodes. The first was on the 25th of May in 1968, just one day before her 11th birthday. She lured 4-year-old Martin Brown into an abandoned house on Street, Margaret's Road in Scotswood. When his body was discovered by other children later, there were no obvious signs of struggle or visible wounds at first glance. Police initially treated it as a tragic accident. Yet Mary's behavior afterward unsettled everyone. She reportedly walked around, asking children if they wanted to see a dead boy, and spoke of Martin's death with odd detachment. She left strange notes in a nursery school. One supposedly said, "I murder so I may come back." At first, these acts were understood wrongly, as pranks or youthful shock. But as events unfolded, grim truths emerged. Then came the second killing. On the 31st of July, 1968, Mary, now 11, along with Norma Joyce Bell, no relation, who was 13, lured 3-year-old Brian Howe to a wasteland. The cruelty this time was without ambiguity. Brian was strangled. The body showed signs of mutilation. Scissors had been used to cut into his skin. His hair had been cut. After leaving the scene, Mary reportedly returned hours later to reposition the body. This was no accident. When the police began to investigate, they found Mary's name repeatedly in interviews with neighborhood children. Evidence mounted. She had drawn disturbing pictures, had been unusually fascinated with what had happened, acted coldly in the days after. Eventually, she confessed. But even in confession, Mary's demeanor was chillingly detached. She showed little remorse, as though she did not fully grasp what she had done. At her trial in December 1968, she was 11 years and 6 months old. She was found guilty of 2 counts of manslaughter, not murder, on the grounds of diminished responsibility. In legal terms, that meant the court accepted that her mental or personality condition had impaired her ability to understand or control her actions to the full degree. A key psychiatrist, Dr. David Westbury, testified that Mary was diagnosed with a psychopathic personality disorder, not mental illness in the sense of psychosis, but a serious disorder of personality. The judge sentenced Mary to be detained at Her Majesty's pleasure, meaning an indefinite sentence. Until it was judged, she no longer posed a danger to others. Officials noted that at her age, prison was not appropriate, but the necessary protection of the public came first. Mary spent nearly 12 years in secure institutions. She was gradually transitioned to less secure settings. In 1980, she was released at age 23 on license, granted a new identity, and moved under supervision. The goal, in effect, was to allow her to re-enter society under conditions meant to reduce risk and permit rehabilitation. After her release, Mary Bell's relative peace was preserved by law. She was granted lifelong anonymity. A high court order in 2003 Under Article 8 of the European Convention on Human Rights, the right to private and family life ensured that neither her new identity nor any details that might reveal her whereabouts could be published. This protection extended equally to her daughter. The court found that the case was exceptional due to Mary's extreme youth at the time of the offenses, her abusive childhood, the threat of public harassment, and the risk that disclosure might damage her mental health or the safety of both her and her child. It accepted that she and her family had moved repeatedly, changed identities several times, suffered hostility, and even attacks when exposed. The media did not strongly oppose the anonymity order. Public reaction was, and remains, deeply divided. Families of the victims felt betrayed when Mary published a book about her own life, in cooperation with author Gitta Sereni. Critics argued she profited from the crime and that her anonymity order still allowed her to re-enter public debate without full accountability. For others, Mary's case raised essential questions about justice. Can someone who committed such acts as a child be rehabilitated? Should society allow a second chance to someone who might still be haunted by their past? How much weight should we give to childhood trauma when assessing moral responsibility? Today, her exact location is unknown to the public. She lives under her assumed identity. She has had to move multiple times to avoid media intrusion and threats. Her anonymity remains protected by law. Her daughter and granddaughter are also shielded from identification. In the end, the Mary Bell case is more than a crime story. It is a portrait of extremes: childhood cruelty, legal mercy, public horror, and an ongoing tension between the rights of victims, the rights of society to know, and the rights of a person who was a child when the crime was done. Mary Bell will always raise the unanswerable. Can someone so young, damaged by environment, become something monstrous, and if they survive, can they ever be allowed to heal in peace? In the summer of 2012, Star City, West Virginia, usually quiet, unassuming, ordinary, was rocked by something nobody could have imagined. 16-year-old Skylar Annette Neese disappeared into the night, and what followed would become one of the most shocking betrayals among friends America would ever see. Skylar was more than just a girl gone missing. She was the only child of doting parents Mary and Dave Neese. An honor student with dreams of becoming a criminal defense attorney, she balanced school, a part-time job at a fast food restaurant, friends, and long evenings online. She laughed easily, worked hard, trusted deeply. Those who knew her said she lit up the room with her smile. Her closest friends were Shelia Ray Eddy and Rachel Shoaf. The three girls seemed inseparable: late-night chats, hangouts, social media posts full of inside jokes. But beneath the photos and status updates, tension was quietly building. Skylar began to feel excluded. She complained to others that Shelia and Rachel were keeping secrets, mocking her, sometimes pushing her to the margins of their trio. On social media, Skylar posted cryptic messages, not quite calls for help, but traces of frustration. Then came the night of July 6, 2012. After working at her job, Skylar returned home to her family's apartment, as usual. Late that night, just past midnight, she slipped out of her bedroom window and got into a car driven by Shelia and Rachel. That was the last time anyone among her family or community saw her alive. The next hours were full of lies. Shelia and Rachel denied to authorities what really happened. They claimed to have driven around, dropped Skylar off, made it sound like she simply went away voluntarily. Meanwhile, Skylar's parents began a frantic search. Flyers were posted. Television appeals were made. Authorities at first treated the case like a runaway, because by law and practice, there had to be waiting periods, procedures to follow before declaring a teen in grave danger. But Skylar's family knew something was terribly wrong. Months passed. Skylar's bed sat untouched. The missing posters seemed helpless. Then, in early January of 2013, Rachel Shoaf broke under pressure. Amid investigation, interviews, the rising weight of deception, she confessed. She and Shelia had plotted Skylar's murder in advance. They had asked Skylar to go with them under a false pretext to smoke marijuana. Hidden in their car were knives, cleaning supplies, a shovel, clothes to change into, tools of a horror they claimed they did not want to use, but had planned. They drove together across the state line into Pennsylvania to a wooded area they had visited before. Once there, they asked Skylar to fetch a lighter from the car. While she had her back turned, they counted to 3 as they had agreed. On 3, the attack began. Skylar tried to run. She even managed to grab one of their knives and wounded Rachel above the ankle in self-defense. But Shelia and Rachel overwhelmed her, stabbing her repeatedly over 50 times. When no sound came, when there was silence, they believed Skylar was dead. They tried to bury her, but the ground was too rocky. Unable to dig, they covered her body with leaves and branches. Then they drove away. After Rachel's confession led them to Skylar's remains in Wayne Township, Greene County, Pennsylvania, the legal consequences followed. Rachel Shoaf pled guilty to second-degree murder. She was sentenced to 30 years in prison with eligibility for parole after 10 years. Shelia Eddy pled guilty to first-degree murder and received life imprisonment with mercy in West Virginia law, meaning she could be eligible for parole after 15 years. Throughout those long months from disappearance to discovery and then trial, the contradictions cut deepest. Shelia helped post missing person flyers. Rachel mourned publicly. Both acted like distraught friends, even as they hid their guilt. The community looked for Skylar. The parents pleaded for her return. Meanwhile, those who had betrayed her carried on with a facade of grief. The case's aftermath rippled far beyond the courtroom and beyond Star City. Skylar's Law was passed in West Virginia, changing how missing children alerts are handled, removing waiting periods when there is reason to believe someone is in danger so that alerts can go out quickly, even if law enforcement initially treats a case as a runaway. Years later, people still speak of Skylar. Podcasts revisit her story. True crime documentaries compare this case to others. Her family still lives with the ache. 2 girls, who were once her closest friends, now imprisoned. Rachel has expressed remorse. In her parole hearings, she apologized, admitted guilt, and has said that the murder was something she deeply regrets. Shelia, by contrast, has shown little public remorse. Skylar's body was found long after the summer heat had faded. But her story refuses to cool. It lingers proof that betrayal can be nearer than we think, that teenage friendship can hide darkness, and that even in a world of cameras and social media, horror can unfold in silence. For many, Skylar is not just a victim. She is a warning that we must listen closely to the small cries, the cryptic messages, the moments when someone is uneasy and alone. Because sometimes those are the first signs of something unspeakable waiting in the dark. It was a late summer evening in August of 2013 in Aurora, Colorado, when things inside a quiet suburban house shifted from tense to tragically irreversible. The air felt heavy, the kind of night when porch lights glowed soft orange and crickets chirped under a darkening sky, but inside one of those homes, something inside 18-year-old Isabella Guzman had long since snapped. Isabella, with her long dark hair and striking face, was on the surface just another high school graduate, trying to carve out her place in the world. Teachers found her to be at times defiant, at others withdrawn. Her mother, Yunhai Moy, and her stepfather, Ryan Hoy, frequently clashed with her over rules and respect. These arguments had escalated in recent days into threats and fear. Court documents later revealed that 2 days before the deadliest night, Isabella had threatened her mother and spat in her face. The day before the attack, she sent an email to Yunhai Moy that said simply, "You will pay." On the morning of August 28th, Yunhai Moy, alarmed by the tone of that message, reached out for help. She called the police, worried about what might happen. Officers responded, spoke with family members, and warned Isabella that her mother might exercise her legal right to evict her from the house. That same day, Yunhai asked Isabella's biological father to join them in the backyard for what she hoped would be a cooling conversation, a chance to talk about respect, boundaries, and what it meant to live under the same roof. The father left with a fragile hope that things might change. But as night settled, whatever hope remained unraveled into horror. Yunhai Moy went upstairs to take a shower. Isabella followed, knife in hand. In the bathroom, the violence exploded. Isabella stabbed her mother 79 times. 31 of those wounds struck the face, the rest the neck and torso. The screams alerted her stepfather, who burst through the door to find the gruesome crime scene, Isabella standing over Yunhai Moy, the knife in hand, blood everywhere. Isabella fled the house, but was tracked down and arrested the next day. From the moment the news broke, reactions were stunned, neighbors whispered. Journalists covered every emerging detail. What made the case even more unnerving weren't just the facts, but Isabella's demeanor. When photographed at the time of arrest, she wore what some called a strange half-smile. In court, witnesses described her as blank, detached, sometimes smiling at inappropriate moments, as though the seriousness did not register. As the legal process unfolded, a key question arose. Was this brutal act the product of criminal intent or the symptom of severe mental derangement? Psychological experts testified that Isabella had schizophrenia. She was not simply angry or lost. She was caught in delusions so deep that she believed her mother was not her mother, but a malevolent being named Cecilia who needed to be destroyed in order to save the world. She reported visual and auditory hallucinations. She believed she was acting on a higher mission. Prosecutors argued that her condition was not invented, but well documented, and that she was incapable of understanding the difference between right and wrong at the time. Her plea, not guilty by reason of insanity, the court accepted it. Rather than being sentenced to prison, Isabella was committed to a state mental health hospital, Colorado Mental Health Institute at Pueblo, where she would stay until mental health professionals determined she no longer posed a danger to herself or others. Understandably, many felt the verdict was unsatisfying or even unjust. They found it impossible to reconcile the brutality of the attack, 79 knife wounds, the personal nature of the violence with an outcome that meant freedom was possible. But the law in Colorado allows a defendant to avoid prison if mental illness renders them not responsible for their actions in the legal sense. Prosecutors said the clinical evidence was overwhelmingly clear. This was not just a case of teenage defiance or domestic conflict, but catastrophic mental illness. Time passed. The story receded from the front pages until a newer wave of interest returned, fueled by social media. By the year 2020, videos of Isabella in court, her distant gaze, occasional unsettling facial expression had resurfaced on TikTok and YouTube. For many younger viewers, she became a dark kind of fascination, a figure in true crime lore. Discussion threads debated her appearance, her behavior, whether she was being manipulated, abused, ill, or dangerous. Some expressed horror, others expressed sympathy, saying perhaps she deserved compassion more than condemnation. Isabella herself, in interviews conducted within the hospital, has said she believes she has changed. She insists medication and therapy restored her sanity. She has alleged that she was physically and mentally abused at home, and that tensions worsened after she left the family's religion. She claims her family were Jehovah's Witnesses, and that conflicts with her upbringing escalated when she quit at about age 14. She also reported that she filed a report in 2015 accusing a hospital employee of sexual assault. She said procedural hurdles hindered any meaningful investigation. Meanwhile, the legal and psychiatric systems continue to ask, when, if ever, is it safe to release someone who committed such an act? In June 10 of 2021, there was a ruling that allowed Isabella to leave the state hospital for certain activities under supervision, an incremental movement rather than full freedom. And still, for many in the community, the pain remains. Yunhai Moy, a mother remembered not just as a victim, but as someone whose life was ended in the place that should have felt safest. A daughter lost to illness and violence. The trial, the verdict, the hospital stays all are part of a story that Americans keep returning to because it raises unavoidable questions. When someone is sick, where is responsibility? When someone is dangerous but mentally ill, what does justice require? What does mercy look like? The image that sticks is not only the crime scene or the courtroom. It's that empty stare in photographs. That unnatural smile when others would weep. That moment when a child of a home, not yet fully an adult, became for many a symbol of the fragile boundary between reason and unreason.